is in eliminating any need to refer to anybody other than their cronies. So they surround themselves with their yes men, and then, as it were, produce policy, decide how the structure of education should be run, and then proceed accordingly. So though whatever we may think or say about Gove, actually he isn't the problem. The problem is the way education is run.
Well, thank you very much. I could start in a kind of upbeat way by saying, you know, there are lots of terrible things, but, you know, in the trade union movement we have a little slogan, don't more organise. So actually I think I'm following on from Michael by saying stuff has to be done about this. But I don't underestimate how difficult it is, because teachers really are ground down by stuff that's going on in their classroom. But actually, if you're going back to Australia, you know what kind of government they just elected, don't you? It'll be a government that goes with all of the things that Parson Salberg calls, and listen to the acronym, the Global Education Reform Movement. That is what is infecting GERM, Global Education Reform Movement. It's what is infecting lots and lots of education systems. So actually, you can't necessarily get out of it by just getting away from Gove, because Michael is exactly right, but actually, if we didn't have Gove, we would have somebody else fronting the terrible coalition policies, and it is the role that successive governments have given to the Secretary of State that's a huge problem. So actually, I think we have all got to make sure that we are actually beginning to fight back against this, and I think that some of the things, like so many of you being here this evening, are beginning to say we really can't have this anymore. And in our different ways, as parents, as governors, as teachers, as students, and as school students, that's what we have to do.
Before Julian takes the microphone, can I just ask you, you had your hands up earlier when I asked if you were teachers. Bearing in mind Julie's questions from somebody who's left the profession, how many of you put your hand up if you would rather not be a teacher in 2 years' time, given the state of things? Okay, so we've got maybe half a dozen. Okay, Julian.
Yeah, thanks very much, and good evening, everybody. From a local government perspective, we're clearly under enormous pressure financially. In Ealing, we've had, over the 4 years from 2010 to 2014, £87 million of cuts, many of which, well, we've tried to mitigate that, and actually only 30% of that 87 million is actually cutting services. But unfortunately, we have had to cut our school improvement service. We're not happy about that at all, but the scale of cuts that we're dealing with are enormous. And the other problem that we've got is, and this is right across London, but particularly we've got this problem in Ealing, where our birth rate has gone up by 30–35% in the last 10 years, and therefore we are making a choice as a Labour authority to make sure that the extra school buildings that need to be provided to provide these extra school places are proper school buildings. We're not putting pupils in leaky porta cabins. Once you make that decision, that is expensive. We've got limited funding from the government to be able to do that. Up to 2016, we will have had to have found about £190 million to expand our primary schools. Of that, we are having to find ourselves through borrowing, and we have to find the revenue savings to pay the interest on that of about, we're finding about 100 million in terms of capital funding to expand our schools and to provide proper facilities for our kids. Now, I think we're doing a pretty good job in a very, very difficult situation, but it's not easy, and we've had to take some difficult choices, some pragmatic choices, which I'm sure we'll get onto later.
So if there's one thing that you change, you want more funding?
Well, certainly more money, because that bulge that's in our primary schools at the moment is going to go into our high schools. So by 2019, we will need at least another 2 new high schools. And quite frankly, I'm not quite sure where the funding's going to come to be able to build those. But equally, I think what we need is localism. The government talks a lot about localism, but actually we all know in education that is probably the worst offender in terms of centralisation and not allowing decisions to be made locally, and for local authorities to be involved in school allocations and also school improvement, challenging academies and free schools.
Just somewhat briefer than that, if you can. Just what if there was a single thing you'd change, Christine?
The accountability systems that operate in schools. No teacher thinks that we're not accountable to parents, to pupils, to the community. But the combination of league tables, high-stakes testing, the punitive Ofsted regime, and schools being told the only thing that they can measure by a pencil and paper test are things that matter, that's what's taking all the joy out of education for the pupils and for teachers.
I see the problem as one, echoing what other people are saying, that the problem is how education is run. And because it's quite clear already from the noises coming out of the Labour Party, they have no intention of changing it. That Tristram Hunt is already talking, you just listen to the language, he uses the word I, this is what I want. Well, who are you? I mean, what do you know? I mean, it's an extraordinary notion that one person, no matter how wise, or in some occasions stupid, these people are, why do they think they have what's needed in order to run this massive, million-wide, complex institution that we call education? So what I would wish is for more of these. This is the only way that it's going to change, that we have a proper campaign for education that, if you like, relocates education in the democratic roots of the people. You know, they used to be in London, you've seen them on the side of old buildings. I always forget which way round the monogram goes. It says either says LSB or SLB, the School Board for London. That was a democratic institution involving parents and teachers in the running of schools. Yeah? There are institutions, there are models in English and British history as to how schools could be run. We've got to reconnect with that and have a national campaign to connect with it, which involves parents and teachers and local government and also university researchers, people who study education, ideally teachers themselves should be involved in that. That's what's needed. So the magic wand is not really my magic wand, but it's the hope for a campaign.
Judy, can I just ask you? I know there's no short answer.
But, you know, we've seen various models. Just to take one example, I work largely within English language and literacy work, and people will remember that in the early 90s there was something called the Literacy Project. Now, it's not a perfect model, but let's look at how it worked. What happened was that at both at local and national level, teachers were invited, alongside people who do research in education, to, if you like, observe and experiment and try out what does it mean, what does literacy mean? And what does, and I used a funny word, oracy, talk, what does it mean and how do children learn? And so a massive amount of effort went in. It's called the Language and the National Curriculum Project. And massive amounts of work went into it, and there were local meetings and regional meetings and national meetings, and researchers were involved, teachers were involved, they brought the work they were doing. Teachers were sharing practice. I participated in several of them as a writer in schools who goes into schools, and I put in my 2 penny worth. It was worth no more or anything less than a classroom teacher, and a massive involvement took place in it. By the time it got to the point where it was due to report, it had already cost 20 million. And then in one of these classic blows from central government, they realised something dangerous was happening, that it was something resembling workers' control. This is immensely scary for governments when they see that people in work are taking possession of it and that they know what they're doing because they are the people doing the work. They got scared, abolished the law, burned 20 million quid, and the only thing that came out of it was a rather obscure book by a guy called Ron Carter, who was the HMI at the time, on grammar. And that was the only thing that came out of it. Somewhere, sitting in an archive, are thousands and thousands of documents and portfolios of children's work, looking at emergent writing, looking at talk. Now that was a mini model of the kinds of ways in which education could run, in which the expertise of classroom teachers, if you like, observing their own practice, trying things out, sharing practice across schools, between schools, and not thinking constantly, as you said, about assessment, high-stakes testing, but saying, try this, does this work? Why does this work better than that? What kind of children were you working with? Why would that happen? Now, my criticism perhaps of that was that, of course, it didn't involve the local government element particularly, it didn't involve parents and so on. In an ideal world, that would have been factored in too, and the parents could have come in and seen the kind of work that teachers were doing. So there isn't this thing that has happened in the past where teachers have run ahead of parents and done things that maybe parents say, well, what's going on now? Why is this happening? We used to do X and now you're doing Y. But at the same time, as a mini model, I thought it was terrific, and of course if it had happened right the way across the board, in primary, secondary, across every one of the subject areas, we would have had by now an immensely dynamic, professional setup in which teachers were professionalising themselves through observation, through their own research, working alongside academics, and in various structures, locally, regionally and nationally, sharing all that, and policies would have emerged that teachers themselves and parents would be invested in. It was a little tiny glimpse, and because it was good, it had to be smashed.
But who would, under whose aegis would that kind of thing have flourished? Would politicians let that happen, or do we need a separate body?
I'm not unrealistic. In an ideal world, we'd live in a socialist paradise, but I know we're not living in that at the moment. We have ministers of education, we have that. But if you take this simple example of this First World War crap that's gone on, imagine if, as a Secretary of State for Education, instead of thinking of yourself as the world expert on the First World War suddenly, though next week it might be aeronautics, and the following week it might be butterflies, we've no idea, but this week it's First World War, imagine if the Secretary of State for Education saw that his or her job was to convene a national debate about the First World War. So instead of putting his mouth there, he put some money there, and he got the top people who've examined the First World War, who got sons and daughters of people who were in the First World War. We looked at testimonies, and they ran a one-week teaching about the First World War, beamed it out to every school. We would all benefit. That would be a completely different way of viewing the job. The job of the Secretary of State is to democratise learning. That would be his or her job. At the moment, there is only one model. This model of, it's basically a Mussolini or Napoleon model. Probably it's nearer to Napoleon than Mussolini. It's the only model we've got. But given that ultimately that's the system we're working with and that person is elected, then there is a way of conceiving, even within the present system, that it could be different. So, at the moment, that's what we're working with, so that's what I would think of, but I can think of others.
I think that does sound very exciting, Mike. I think a more practical and possibly more likely, although frankly not that likely at the moment, way of looking at this is what we really need is re-democratised local authorities. I mean, the Labour government, I'm afraid, started this with all the cabinet stuff and scrutiny panels and so on. I mean, I can remember when education committees in local education authorities actually meant something, and they were participatory, and you did have parents on them, and you did have presentations to them, and certainly I'm old enough to have worked in the ILEA, well, we did run good curriculum projects, which did engage people from a lot of schools, where actually teachers and parents and students did participate in those things. So I think we need a re-democratised local authority that actually does have some real power, and with parents, where parents in the local community engage with it. One of the things we say in the NUT is that we think that we have sometimes often been stronger defenders of local government and local authorities than they've been in themselves. Because now they've given up on housing, fortunately not in England, but lots of them have given up on schools and just don't all be academies. They've privatised collecting the bins. So, I mean, I don't know what they do except now collect fees for going to council meetings. Julian will tell us that they do something better in England. But I think that in the National Youth Teachers we believe that is the model. And actually, it would be the local council, the local authority, the local education authority, with the local community who would, for example, look at school place planning. One of the reasons why we've got the schools places crisis in London and in lots of other places is because, Michael, it's the very opposite of localism that Julian talked about. Everything is highly centralised in the DfE. So if you want to open a new school now, you've got a fairly good chance of getting a free school. You've got a very difficult chance if you want to open a local authority school. And lots lots and lots of free schools that have opened in places where there are already too many school places. And then you go to Ealing, and they haven't got enough school places. So re-democratising, re-democratic local authorities is what we need to do.
Julian, do you feel somewhat emasculated then as
well, I think certainly there needs to be a distinction between national and local politicians, but the first thing I would say is that any politician worth their salt would recognise the fantastic work that goes on in our schools by our teachers, by the governors, through the support of parents, the efforts of the pupils. And I think certainly I, for one, recognise that absolutely, and know that our role as local politicians, as a local authority, is almost as certainly a safety net where we need to help where things have not worked out, and we need to intervene to help standards come back up. And that may mean that we work with other successful schools around that school. So we need a kind of family of schools within the local authority all working together, which is why we've tried to persuade our schools not to go the academy route, not to take the shilling, basically, that's been offered to them. I think we don't need ideological politicians, and effectively the Secretary of State at the moment is using education as a political football. And the point about free schools being put in places where there isn't a need is ludicrous. We've already got massive shortages of resources and extra pressure for more school places. So why have a system which kind of uses a scattergun approach, which almost is designed to put schools in the wrong places? And at the moment, if somebody wants to start a free school, they don't have to come and talk to the local authority. And certainly in London, as London councils, as a group of councils together, we are campaigning to change that so that we can actually get any free school provider talking to local authorities at the earliest possible stage, so that we can direct them to where the need actually is. That may not, I still don't think that's the right system, but it would make what we've got work better.
But it's true, I had to work.
So, all the results, whether it's in America, Australia, Britain, wherever it is, the way they test its success, the implementation of SSF or whatever other system of phonics and intensive phonics teaching, is to test children reading out loud. But every single person in this room knows that it's quite possible to read out loud something you don't understand. I can read Italian out loud, but I don't understand it. And you will all have taught people who can read out loud, maybe sometimes stumbling, but without understanding what they're reading. So this is problematic because this is how they have sold this system. When I say sold, they've actually spent, it just came out this week under Freedom of Information, they've spent 23 million quid subsidising schools to buy the policies, to buy the approved schemes, phonics schemes. They've spent 23 million quid on that, so they've put their money literally where their mouth is on the matter. Now, reading out loud is not sufficient. You have to do many other things in order for children to read with understanding. But if the only system of assessment, like the phonics check, as they call it, the phonics, what do they call it? Screening, the phonics screening check, that's right. All that can do is find out whether children can read decontextualised words, whether they can see a word, read it out loud, so-called correctly. This is not reading. Reading is making